At this unit, we're going to talk about how our model, the aggregate demand, aggregate supply, would explain the business cycle. And we'll see a further explanation of inflation. So, the business cycle occurs when aggregate demand and short-term aggregate supply fluctuate, but money wage doesn't change rapidly enough to keep real GDP to the potential. Here we're talking about the essence of the model, where it believes that in the long run, the economy will reach the equilibrium automatically. We will shift from whatever real GDP we have to the potential GDP. However, what makes this process takes time, that some of the variables in the economy are reluctant to move. So let's see how would this model explain recession and expansion. So in the upper panel, we have the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. In the lower panel, we have a fine black line that represents the potential GDP. On the x-axis, we have the time. On the y-axis, we have the level of real GDP. In the upper panel, as you can see, we have a short-run equilibrium. Why is it short-run? Because it's not over the potential GDP. It is less than the potential GDP. Is our employment rate is under the full employment rate. We are under the natural rate of unemployment. So here we have what we call recessionary gap. Why? Because our real GDP is under the potential GDP, so we have no enough production for everyone to be employed. So what if other variables that keeps the economy out of potential GDP has changed, and now we are having an equilibrium, a short-run equilibrium over the long-run aggregate supply. Here it's not anymore short-run equilibrium, it is long-run equilibrium, and as you can see in the lower panel, our curve is now on the potential GDP. We are at full employment. So what if the position now of the short-term aggregate supply is above the potential GDP? This means that we are under the natural rate of unemployment. This means that we are above the full employment, and here we have inflationary gap. This means that eventually the economy will reach the long-run equilibrium, however at a higher price. Let's see how would this take place. We're going to talk about the aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and a further explanation for inflation. So here we have a long-run equilibrium. Everyone is happy. We have a full employment. However, for one reason, there was a change, a shift in the aggregate demand to the right. We have a lot of reasons that could make this. Higher expectation of higher income, higher profit, increase in the quantity of money, decrease in interest rate, a lot of factors that would cause the aggregate demand to shift to the right. As you can see, as there is a shift to the right for the aggregate demand, this caused the price level to go up from 110 to 115. And here we have inflationary gap, as the real GDP is above the potential GDP. So starting a long-run equilibrium, increase in aggregate demand, shift the aggregate demand curve rightward, and this will actually cause an increase in production. Why? Price levels had went up, so more producers are encouraged to start their own companies, and this will increase the production. So we have a higher price level and a higher production. However, real GDP would increase, but there is at a higher price, and we have an inflationary gap. So when our workers see that the prices went up from 110 to 115, they will start demanding and seeking for higher wages. So the money wage start to change as the old contracts of the employees would expire. They are expecting a new contract with a higher wage. So as the wages gradually increase, this will cause some of the businesses to get out of the market as they cannot bear the higher wages, and this will cause the short-run aggregate supply to shift leftward, causing or bringing back the real GDP to the potential GDP at even a higher price. So the money wage begins to rise too, and the short-run aggregate supply begins to decrease. The SAS shift leftward, the price level rises, and the GDP decreases until we reach or re-reach the potential GDP again. So what about here? Here we have a chart for the short-run aggregate supply curve. The short-run aggregate supply curve actually shifts to the left, maybe with the effect in a change in one of the factors of production like petrol. So when the price of petrol went up in the 70s, it caused large number of businesses to get out of business, and this will shift the short-run aggregate supply to the left and causes a recessionary gap. At this point, we have been introduced to how would aggregate supply and aggregate demand explain the business cycle through the recessionary gap and the inflationary gap. We have seen what is the mechanism for this recessionary gap and inflationary gap to take place. Okay guys, now we are done with the aggregate demand, aggregate supply curve chapter. See you next chapter.